Book 18, Emmeline and the Missing Poodles. Emmeline lived in a very tall building, right in the middle of a bustling, windy city. She was a terribly clever girl who enjoyed wearing mismatched socks and solving complex puzzles. Emmeline never went anywhere without her best friend and designated guardian, Mr. Barnaby. Mr. Barnaby was a small, exceptionally hairy creature from a dark, uncharted bog in Scandinavia. He did not speak much, but he was an excellent listener with very sharp ears together. They made the finest amateur detective team in the entire metropolitan area. Emmeline kept a small notebook in her pocket for recording interesting observations. Mr. Barnaby carried a small umbrella to protect his magnificent fur from sudden downpours. They spent most of their days wandering the long corridors of their massive apartment building. Life was always an adventure when you knew exactly where to look. Their home was located on the 200th floor of the prestigious Marmalade building. The apartment was a sprawling maze of towering bookshelves and dusty, velvet-covered armchairs. Every wall was covered in framed maps, vintage photographs, and peculiar paintings of aristocratic badgers. A gigantic brass chandelier hung from the ceiling, completely covered in cobwebs and tiny crystal teardrops. The floors were lined with exotic rugs that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. Emmeline slept in a massive four-poster bed that resembled a small wooden fortress. Mr. Barnaby preferred to sleep in a cushioned wicker basket near the radiator. The kitchen was stocked entirely with crumpets, marmalade, and an assortment of exotic teas. From the living room window, they could see the tiny yellow taxis crawling through the streets below. It was a perfectly splendid place for a young detective to conduct her business. Emmeline's parents were world-famous explorers who were almost never at home. They spent their lives traveling the globe in search of extremely rare antique spoons. Currently, they were somewhere in the remote jungles of South America hunting for the elusive silver soup spoon. They communicated with Emmeline exclusively by sending beautifully illustrated postcards. The postcards arrived every Tuesday, delivered by a rather grumpy postman named Mr. Higgins. Emmeline meticulously cataloged every single postcard in a large leather-bound album. She did not mind her parents being away, as it gave her plenty of time for sleuthing. She knew they loved her very much because they always signed their cards with triple kisses. Besides, having adults around would undoubtedly interfere with her rigorous investigative schedule. Mr. Barnaby was all the supervision she realistically required anyway. Emmeline possessed a fascinating and somewhat invasive hobby. She loved to quietly listen at the heavy oak doors of her various neighbors. She would carefully press her left ear against the wood to capture snippets of peculiar conversations. She wrote down every single detail, no matter how trivial, in her trusty red notebook. She knew that Mrs. Plum on the third floor secretly fed caviar to her Persian cat. She also knew that Mr. Snodgrass on the 50th floor wore a toupee that often fell off. Emmeline considered this a vital public service, gathering intelligence for future mysteries. Mr. Barnaby usually stood guard during these eavesdropping sessions, sweeping the hallway with his gaze. He would gently tug on her skirt if he heard anyone approaching the corridor. Gathering secrets was hard work, but someone simply had to do it. The grand mystery officially began on a particularly gloomy Thursday afternoon. Emmeline was busy organizing her collection of oddly shaped paper clips when she heard a loud gasp. The gasp echoed loudly down the corridor, coming from the apartment of Madame Pumpernickel. Madame Pumpernickel was a wealthy widow who owned a priceless collection of tiny porcelain poodles. Emmeline immediately grabbed her notebook and sprinted out the front door. Mr. Barnaby grabbed his umbrella and waddled hastily right behind her. They found the elderly woman standing in her doorway, clutching her pearl necklace in shock. Someone had completely emptied her display cabinet of every single porcelain poodle. The crime scene was completely pristine. Without a single sign of forced entry, Emmeline knew instantly that this was a job for the city's greatest amateur detective. Emmeline carefully stepped into the plushly carpeted apartment to examine the scene of the crime. She pulled a shiny brass magnifying glass from her oversized coat pocket. The empty display cabinet stood in the center of the room, looking terribly sad and bare. Emmeline instructed Madame Pumpernickel to sit down and drink a strong cup of peppermint tea. She scoured the floorboards, searching for any microscopic trace of the devious thief. Suddenly, her magnifying glass caught a tiny glimmer near the edge of the velvet curtains. She knelt down and carefully picked up a small, shiny yellow feather with her tweezers. Madame Pumpernickel confirmed that she did not own any birds, let alone yellow ones. This single yellow feather was the very first clue in the Great Poodle heist. Emmeline carefully placed the feather inside a small plastic evidence bag. Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby retreated to their own apartment to discuss the crucial evidence. She pinned the plastic bag containing the yellow feather to her massive corkboard. Mr. Barnaby sat on the rug, carefully brushing his luxurious fur with a silver comb. He stared intently at the feather, letting out a soft, thoughtful grunt. Emmeline agreed with his silent assessment that the thief must be somewhat flamboyant. Only a flamboyant thief would wear garments that shed bright yellow feathers during a heist. She pulled down a massive encyclopedia of exotic birds from the top shelf of the bookcase. They spent an hour flipping through pages, but the feather did not match any known bird. It was clearly a synthetic feather, likely from an extravagant feather boa or a flamboyant hat. The plot was rapidly thickening into a very satisfying mystery. It was time for the detective duo to gather their essential field equipment. Emmeline put on her favorite trench coat, which was delightfully covered in hidden pockets. In the left pocket, she placed a red notebook, a fountain pen, and 3 extra paper clips. In the right pocket, she stored a spool of invisible thread and a small bag of powdered chalk. Mr. Barnaby strapped a tiny leather utility belt around his exceptionally hairy waist. His belt contained a measuring tape, a tiny flashlight, and an emergency tin of sardines. Emmeline tied her hair back with a piece of sturdy, sensible twine. They stood in front of the hallway mirror, admiring their highly professional appearances. They looked exactly like the kind of people who solve complex porcelain thefts. Emmeline nodded to Mr. Barnaby, signaling that it was time to hit the pavement. Their first logical stop was the main lobby to interrogate the building's elevator operator. The operator was a tall, incredibly thin man named Bartholomew who wore a maroon uniform. Bartholomew knew absolutely everything about everyone who entered or exited the Marmalade building. Emmeline approached him, flipped open her red notebook, and tapped her pen against the page. She asked if he had seen anyone unusual leaving the building with a large bag. Bartholomew scratched his chin thoughtfully, his eyes darting toward the ornate ceiling. He mentioned that a very tall woman had entered the elevator just an hour ago. She was carrying a massive, suspiciously clinking canvas sack over her shoulder. She was also wearing an absolutely massive hat entirely covered in bright yellow feathers. Emmeline smiled triumphantly, realizing her theory about the synthetic feather was entirely correct. Bartholomew happily provided them with a few more vital details about the suspect. The feathery woman had specifically asked for directions to the old botanical gardens. She seemed very nervous, constantly checking her reflection in the polished brass elevator doors. When the elevator reached the lobby, she sprinted out the front doors at a terrifying speed. Bartholomew noted that she left behind a faint scent of cheap lavender perfume in the cabin. Emmeline wrote down the word lavender in large, bold letters in her notebook. She thanked Bartholomew for his cooperation and handed him a butterscotch candy as a reward. Mr. Barnaby gave the tall man a polite, furry nod of appreciation. The trail was hot, and they needed to reach the botanical gardens immediately. The chase for the porcelain poodles was officially underway. Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby quickly hailed a bright yellow taxi just outside the Marmalade building. The driver was a very chatty man who kept talking about his impressive collection of vintage hubcaps. Emmeline politely nodded along while secretly reviewing her notes on the yellow feather and the lavender scent. The city streets were completely packed with honking cars and scurrying pedestrians trying to avoid the drizzle. Mr. Barnaby sat perfectly still in the back seat, holding his tiny umbrella across his lap. They finally arrived at the massive iron gates of the old botanical gardens. Emmeline paid the driver with a handful of shiny coins from her coat pocket. The gardens were an absolute jungle of towering palm trees, creeping vines, and extremely thorny rose bushes. It was the perfect place for a thief to hide stolen goods among the dense foliage. They slipped through the heavy gates, keeping a sharp lookout for any sign of yellow feathers. The air inside the botanical gardens was incredibly thick and smelled strongly of damp earth. Emmeline led the way down a winding gravel path, her eyes scanning the ground for clues. She pulled out her magnifying glass again, inspecting the muddy puddles for footprints. Mr. Barnaby sniffed the humid air, trying to detect any lingering trace of cheap lavender perfume. They walked past a massive fountain shaped like a very unhappy-looking stone gargoyle. Emmeline spotted a massive glass greenhouse looming in the distance, partially obscured by the fog. The greenhouse looked completely abandoned with several cracked panes of glass on the roof. It was exactly the sort of creepy location a villain would choose for a secret hideout. Emmeline signaled to Mr. Barnaby with a complex series of rapid hand gestures. They crept toward the glass structure with the utmost caution and absolute silence. Emmeline carefully pushed open the squeaky wooden door of the massive glass greenhouse. Inside, the temperature was sweltering and the air was thick with exotic, brightly colored orchids. Rows upon rows of potted plants stretched out endlessly into the humid green shadows. Suddenly, Mr. Barnaby let out a sharp warning grunt and pointed a hairy finger. Sitting on a wooden bench at the far end of the greenhouse was a very tall woman. She was wearing an absolutely gigantic hat covered entirely in bright yellow. Synthetic feathers. Beside her rested a massive bulging canvas sack that looked heavy enough to hold a collection of poodles. Emmeline felt a surge of triumph as she tightened her grip on her red notebook. She boldly stepped out from behind a large fern, ready to apprehend the suspect. The great poodle mystery was about to be solved in record time. Emmeline cleared her throat loudly, completely startling the tall woman on the wooden bench. The woman spun around, her massive feathered hat wobbling dangerously on her head. Emmeline boldly accused her of stealing Madame Pumpernickel's priceless collection of porcelain poodles. She presented the yellow feather in the plastic bag as her absolute, undeniable proof. Mr. Barnaby stepped forward and crossed his tiny hairy arms in a very intimidating manner. The tall woman looked utterly confused for a moment before bursting into loud, booming laughter. She explained that she was not a thief at all, but rather a professional theatrical hat maker. Her name was Beatrice, and she was simply enjoying a quiet moment among the orchids. The massive canvas sack did not contain stolen poodles, but thousands of heavy glass beads. Emmeline felt a sudden, terrible sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. To prove her innocence, Beatrice completely unzipped the massive canvas bag for Emmeline to inspect. The bag was indeed filled to the brim with thousands of sparkling heavy glass beads. She explained that she was designing a series of exotic bird hats for a new musical. The yellow feather in the hallway must have fallen off when she visited a friend in the building. Beatrice even offered Emmeline a spare pink feather as a souvenir of their strange meeting. Emmeline politely declined the feather and formally apologized for the dreadful misunderstanding. Beatrice waved off the apology, stating that she loved a good amateur detective story. The detective duo trudged out of the greenhouse, feeling incredibly foolish and utterly defeated. The yellow feather had been nothing more than a giant, fluffy red herring. They were completely back to square one in the Great Poodle investigation. The taxi ride back to the Marmalade building was incredibly silent and quite depressing. Mr. Barnaby thoughtfully chewed on a piece of dried kelp from his utility belt. Emmeline furiously scribbled new theories into her notebook, determined to crack the case. She realized she had rushed to judgment based on a single, highly circumstantial clue. A good detective always needed to consider every single possibility before confronting a suspect. As they entered the grand lobby, Bartholomew, the elevator operator, gave them a questioning look. Emmeline simply shook her head and pressed the button for the 200th floor. When they arrived at the scene of the crime, Madame Pumpernickel was still drinking peppermint tea. Emmeline assured the widow that they were not giving up on the missing poodles. It was time to re-examine the crime scene with fresh, unclouded eyes. Emmeline knelt back down on the plush hallway carpet outside Madame Pumpernickel's door. She pulled out her magnifying glass and began to scan the floorboards with excruciating slowness. Mr. Barnaby got down on his hands and knees to assist with the microscopic search. They spent 20 minutes examining every single fiber of the carpet for hidden evidence. Emmeline sprinkled a tiny amount of powdered chalk from her pocket onto the floor. She gently blew the chalk away, revealing a faint, previously invisible impression. It was a tiny, muddy paw print, much too small to belong to a human. Furthermore, it did not look like the paw print of a cat or a normal dog. It looked suspiciously like the footprint of a very small, very sneaky raccoon. Emmeline let out a triumphant gasp and pointed the discovery out to Mr. Barnaby. Mr. Barnaby immediately began sniffing the faint, muddy paw print with great intensity. He let out a low, rumbling growl, confirming that the scent was indeed non-human. Emmeline carefully measured the tiny print with the tape measure from Mr. Barnaby's utility belt. She deduced that the creature must have climbed through the slightly ajar hallway window. The tiny thief had likely stuffed the porcelain poodles into a sack and carried them away. Emmeline realized that animals did not steal porcelain poodles unless they were trained to do so. This meant there was a criminal mastermind operating behind the scenes directing the animal. The mystery was vastly more complicated and exciting than a simple smash and grab. They needed to follow the trail of muddy prints before the chalk completely blew away. Emmeline quickly sketched the paw print in her notebook for future reference. The trail of tiny paw prints led away from the apartment and toward the emergency stairwell. Emmeline carefully pushed open the heavy fire door, wincing at the loud metallic squeak. The stairwell was incredibly dark, illuminated only by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. Mr. Barnaby clicked on his tiny flashlight, casting a bright beam onto the concrete steps. Sure enough, the faint muddy prints continued downward in a rapid, erratic pattern. The detective duo began their long descent, carefully checking each landing for the elusive creature. The descent from the 200th floor took an agonizing amount of time and energy. Emmeline's legs began to ache, but her sheer determination kept her moving downward. Mr. Barnaby occasionally stopped to eat a small sardine for emergency energy. They finally reached the very bottom of the stairwell, panting and exhausted. The trail ended abruptly at a heavy, rusty iron door that led into the building's basement. The basement of the Marmalade building was a terrifying, labyrinthine network of pipes and boilers. Emmeline took a deep breath to steady her nerves before pushing the heavy door open. The air inside smelled of damp concrete, old machinery, and a faint hint of fish. The darkness was nearly absolute. Save for the narrow beam of Mr. Barnaby's flashlight, they could hear the loud rhythmic thumping of the massive heating system echoing around them. It was the perfect, isolated environment for a criminal mastermind to hide their stolen loot. Emmeline gripped her notebook tightly, ready to face whatever dangers lurked in the shadows. She whispered to Mr. Barnaby to stay close and keep his flashlight steady. The final act of their investigation was about to commence in the dark. The basement was an absolute maze of twisting, rusted pipes and massive concrete support pillars. Emmeline carefully stepped over large puddles of questionable, foul-smelling liquid. Mr. Barnaby swept his flashlight beam back and forth, illuminating massive spider webs and old crates. The temperature down here was remarkably cold, causing Emmeline to shiver in her trench coat. The muddy paw prints were much easier to follow on the dusty, untouched concrete floor. The trail led them deeper into the forgotten depths of the Marmalade building. They passed an abandoned laundry room filled with rusted, ancient washing machines. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of a leaky pipe. Emmeline felt a sudden thrill of genuine danger coursing through her young veins. This was exactly the sort of adventure she read about in her detective novels. Suddenly, a distinct scuttling sound echoed from the darkness just up ahead. Emmeline instantly froze, holding her breath and signaling Mr. Barnaby to stop moving. The scuttling sound was accompanied by a faint, high-pitched chattering noise. Mr. Barnaby slowly raised his flashlight, pointing the beam toward a stack of wooden pallets. A pair of bright, glowing eyes reflected the light back at them from the shadows. Emmeline slowly crept forward, her hand reaching into her pocket for her invisible thread. The creature let out an angry hiss, revealing itself to be a surprisingly large raccoon. The raccoon was wearing a tiny custom-made black mask over its eyes like a true burglar. In its nimble little paws, it clutched one of Madame Pumpernickel's missing porcelain poodles. Emmeline had officially located the tiny thief responsible for the grand heist. The masked raccoon glared at them for a long moment before dropping to all fours. It quickly tucked the porcelain poodle under its arm and bolted down a narrow corridor. Emmeline shouted a command, and she and Mr. Barnaby sprinted after the fleeing animal. The raccoon was incredibly fast, easily navigating the treacherous maze of pipes and debris. Mr. Barnaby's short, hairy legs moved like pistons as he tried to keep the flashlight steady. Emmeline nearly tripped over a discarded toolbox but managed to regain her balance. They chased the creature through a heavy, rusted doorway and into an older section of the basement. The raccoon scrambled over a pile of broken furniture and vanished behind a massive boiler. When they reached the boiler, the raccoon was completely gone, leaving only dust behind. The trail had suddenly gone cold in a dead-end room. Emmeline refused to believe that the creature had simply vanished into thin air. She began to thoroughly inspect the brick wall behind the massive, ancient boiler. She tapped the bricks with the end of her flashlight, listening for a hollow sound. Mr. Barnaby assisted by sniffing the mortar for any recent disturbance. After several minutes of intense searching, Emmeline noticed a brick that looked slightly loose. She pressed hard against it, and a loud metallic click echoed through the room. To their absolute astonishment, a section of the brick wall slowly swung inward, revealing a secret passage. The passage was lit by a string of cheap, battery-operated fairy lights. It was a hidden room that was completely unlisted on the building's official blueprints. Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby cautiously stepped through the threshold into the secret lair. The hidden room was an absolute treasure trove of stolen, incredibly eccentric objects. The walls were lined with wooden shelves overflowing with bizarre stolen trinkets. There were jars of rare buttons, stacks of vintage comic books, and a massive collection of missing left shoes. Dozens of fancy umbrellas, previously reported stolen, hung from the low ceiling. Emmeline realized that this room contained every unsolved petty theft in the building's history. The masked raccoon was sitting on a plush velvet cushion in the center of the room. It was casually licking its paws, completely ignoring the detective duo. In the corner of the room stood a large wooden table covered in architectural blueprints. Emmeline approached the table, shining the flashlight on the scattered documents. The blueprints detailed the exact locations of every single air vent in the Marmalade building. Arranged perfectly on a separate display shelf were Madame Pumpernickel's porcelain poodles. Every single one of the 50 fragile figurines was completely intact and undamaged. Emmeline breathed a massive sigh of relief, knowing her client would be thrilled. She pulled her red notebook from her pocket to document the massive stash of stolen goods. This was undoubtedly the biggest breakthrough in her entire amateur detective career. She wondered aloud who could possibly have the time and knowledge to orchestrate such bizarre thefts. The mastermind had to be someone intimately familiar with the building and its eccentric residents. Mr. Barnaby suddenly let out a low, warning growl and pointed his umbrella toward the shadows. A tall figure stepped out from behind a rack of stolen silk scarves. The criminal mastermind had finally decided to reveal themselves. Emmeline gasped in genuine shock as the flashlight illuminated the tall figure's face. It was Bartholomew, the incredibly thin elevator operator who had given them the fake clue. He was no longer wearing his maroon uniform, but a sophisticated velvet smoking jacket. Bartholomew offered them a polite, utterly unrepentant smile as he adjusted his cuffs. He explained that he had trained the raccoon, whose name was Barnaby II, to navigate the air vents. He used his position in the elevator to monitor when residents left their apartments. He had deliberately sent them to the botanical gardens to buy himself time to hide the loot. He confessed that he didn't steal for money, but simply because he loved collecting oddities. He thought he had committed the perfect untraceable crime in his hidden basement lair. He had severely underestimated the tenacity of a clever girl and her hairy companion. Bartholomew sighed dramatically and sat down on a stolen antique wooden rocking chair. He explained that operating an elevator all day was incredibly boring work for a genius mind. He had spent years mapping the ventilation shafts and training his brilliant raccoon accomplice. The porcelain poodles were simply his latest obsession because of their exquisite craftsmanship. He begged Emmeline not to turn him over to the harsh, unforgiving local authorities. He promised to return every single stolen item and permanently dismantle his secret lair. He even offered to let Emmeline have her pick of the stolen vintage umbrellas. Emmeline crossed her arms, considering the complicated ethical dilemma presented before her. She was a detective, but she was also a girl who understood the danger of intense boredom. She turned to Mr. Barnaby to silently consult his vast ancient wisdom on the matter. Mr. Barnaby stared intently at Bartholomew, his hairy brow furrowed in deep concentration. He slowly walked over to the stash of stolen goods and picked up a tin of expensive sardines. He tossed the tin to Bartholomew, then pointed his umbrella firmly toward the exit. Emmeline perfectly understood his silent decree regarding the fate of the elevator operator. She told Bartholomew that they would not call the police under one strict condition. He had to personally return every single item to its rightful owner by tomorrow morning. Furthermore, he had to write a formal rhyming apology letter to Madame Pumpernickel. Bartholomew eagerly agreed to the terms, profusely thanking the merciful detective team. He immediately began packing the porcelain poodles into a padded cardboard box. The great poodle mystery had been resolved through diplomacy and a strict timeline. Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby supervised the packing process to ensure no poodles were left behind. They escorted Bartholomew up the extremely long, incredibly tiring emergency stairwell. It took them nearly an hour to carry the heavy box to the 200th floor. Madame Pumpernickel was absolutely overjoyed to be reunited with her precious porcelain collection. She rewarded Emmeline with a massive jar of homemade, extra chunky marmalade. Bartholomew delivered his rhyming apology and scurried back to the elevator in shame. Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby finally returned to their sprawling, dusty apartment, utterly exhausted. Emmeline meticulously recorded the final details of the case in her red notebook. The city was safe once again, thanks to the finest detective team in the metropolis. It was finally time for a well-deserved cup of tea and a very long nap. The next morning, the sun shone brightly through the dusty windows of the Marmalade building. Emmeline woke up feeling incredibly refreshed and completely satisfied with her previous day's work. She put on a pair of bright green striped socks and a sensible corduroy skirt. Mr. Barnaby was already awake, meticulously brushing his fur while eating a slice of toast. They sat at the large oak dining table enjoying their tea and homemade marmalade. Emmeline reviewed her red notebook, checking off the Great Poodle heist as a massive success. She decided that they needed to officially reorganize their detective equipment for the next case. A good detective always maintained a pristine inventory of chalk, thread, and spare paper clips. She spent an hour organizing her pockets while Mr. Barnaby restocked his tiny utility belt. The day was starting off with perfect, highly organized tranquility. Their peaceful morning was suddenly interrupted by a soft, mysterious scratching sound at the front door. Emmeline grabbed her magnifying glass and quietly crept into the main hallway to investigate. She slowly turned the heavy brass doorknob and flung the door open with dramatic flair. There was absolutely no one in the corridor, just the faint smell of old floor wax. However, lying perfectly centered on the welcome mat was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The envelope was sealed with dark red wax, stamped with the image of a magnifying glass. Emmeline picked it up, noting that the heavy parchment paper felt incredibly expensive and formal. It was addressed simply to the finest amateur detective in the Marmalade Building. She eagerly tore open the seal, her heart pounding with the thrill of a new mystery. She read the elegant, swirling handwriting aloud to Mr. Barnaby. The letter was a formal invitation to an incredibly exclusive gathering that evening. It requested their presence at the Old City Library precisely when the clock struck midnight. The letter was signed by a mysterious organization calling themselves the Society of the Silver Magnifying Glass. Emmeline had read rumors about this legendary group of elite detectives in her favorite books. She never imagined that they actually existed in real life, let alone in her city. She immediately knew that they simply had to attend this incredibly important midnight meeting. Mr. Barnaby gave a firm nod of agreement and double-checked the batteries in his flashlight. They spent the rest of the day anxiously watching the grandfather clock tick away the hours. Emmeline pressed her trench coat, wanting to look as professional as possible for the elite society. The anticipation was almost too much for the young detective to bear. When midnight finally approached, the city was shrouded in a thick, mysterious blanket of fog. Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby slipped out of the Marmalade Building entirely unnoticed by the night watchman. They walked quickly through the damp, empty streets, their footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The Old City Library loomed ahead, a massive stone building guarded by two angry-looking stone lions. The heavy wooden doors were slightly ajar, inviting them into the terrifyingly dark interior. Emmeline pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning loudly in the silent night. The library was completely dark, smelling strongly of old leather and ancient, decaying paper. Suddenly, a dozen small lamps flickered to life, illuminating a large mahogany table in the center. Sitting around the table were the most peculiar-looking people Emmeline had ever seen. She had officially entered the secret inner sanctum of the legendary detective society. There was a woman wearing a heavy veil who sat next to a man with an eye patch. An elderly gentleman in a tweed suit was busy polishing a massive brass telescope. At the head of the table sat a woman with incredibly sharp features and silver hair. The silver-haired woman stood up and formally welcomed Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby to the society. She explained that they had been secretly monitoring Emmeline's impressive detective work for several months. Solving the Great Poodle heist had been the final test of her incredible deductive abilities. The society was incredibly impressed by her clever use of invisible thread and powdered chalk. They were equally impressed by Mr. Barnaby's terrifying growl and excellent tracking skills. Emmeline felt a massive swell of pride in her chest, realizing she was among true peers. She squeezed Mr. Barnaby's hairy hand in sheer excitement. The silver-haired woman presented Emmeline with a small, velvet-lined mahogany box. Inside the box rested a beautiful, heavy silver magnifying glass with her initials engraved on the handle. It was the official badge of membership in the Society of the Silver Magnifying Glass. Emmeline was completely speechless, staring at the beautiful object in absolute awe. She promised the society that she would use it to solve only the most difficult mysteries. The elderly gentleman with the telescope offered her a firm, highly respectful handshake. The veiled woman nodded silently, acknowledging Emmeline as a true master of deduction. It was the greatest honor a young amateur detective could ever possibly receive. She carefully placed the silver magnifying glass into the deepest pocket of her trench coat. She knew she would cherish the heavy, beautiful tool for the rest of her life. Mr. Barnaby was certainly not left out of the grand awards ceremony at the library. The society recognized that a detective is only as good as their designated furry guardian. The man with the eye patch presented Mr. Barnaby with a massive, heavy wooden crate. Mr. Barnaby eagerly pried the lid open with the handle of his tiny umbrella. Inside were 100 tins of the finest, most expensive imported sardines from Norway. Mr. Barnaby let out a joyous, incredibly loud roar of pure appreciation that echoed through the library. He immediately opened a tin and happily devoured the delicious, salty fish. The society members politely applauded his impressive, albeit messy, eating habits. Emmeline knew that Mr. Barnaby had truly earned every single tin in that massive crate. The detective duo had officially hit the absolute pinnacle of their investigative careers. The next morning, back at the Marmalade building, a new postcard finally arrived. Mr. Higgins, the postman, handed it to Emmeline with his usual grumpy, exhausted sigh. The postcard featured a beautiful, hand-drawn illustration of a massive waterfall in the jungle. Her parents wrote that they had successfully located the legendary silver soup spoon of antiquity. They were incredibly excited to return home and add it to their massive spoon collection. Emmeline was happy for them, but she was entirely focused on her own new treasure. She polished her new silver magnifying glass until it gleamed brightly in the morning sunlight. She carefully placed the postcard in her album, right next to the previous week's entry. Life in the apartment was returning to its normal, highly eccentric routine. She felt completely ready for whatever strange events the future might bring. Emmeline and Mr. Barnaby sat by the living room window, looking out over the sprawling city. The tiny yellow taxis continued to crawl through the busy streets far below them. The city was massive, and it was undoubtedly filled with a million unsolved mysteries. There were missing cats to find, stolen umbrellas to recover, and secret societies to assist. Emmeline flipped open her red notebook, ready to document the very next clue she encountered. Mr. Barnaby finished a tin of sardines and began to meticulously brush his magnificent fur. They were the perfect team, constantly vigilant and always prepared for the unexpected. The great poodle heist was closed, but the life of a detective never truly ended. Emmeline smiled, knowing that adventure was always waiting just outside her front door. The city was vast, and her silver magnifying glass was ready to uncover its deepest secrets. The sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the cluttered living room floor. Emmeline closed her notebook and placed it carefully on the dusty velvet-covered armchair. The massive brass chandelier caught the fading light, sparkling beautifully above their heads. Mr. Barnaby curled up in his wicker basket, letting out a soft, contented sigh. It had been an incredibly long, wildly successful week for the young amateur detective. She knew her parents would be incredibly proud of her when they finally returned home. Until then, she would continue to listen at doors and measure muddy footprints. She pulled a warm wool blanket over herself, feeling perfectly safe and completely happy. The Marmalade building was quiet, holding its secrets tightly within its ancient brick walls. Emmeline closed her eyes, dreaming of complex puzzles and bright yellow feathers.